Hello and welcome to the Stack Magazine's podcast. My name is Stephen Watson and I run Stack, the magazine club that delivers a different independent publication to your door every month. This episode, I'm speaking with Charles Emmerson, editor of Translator, the magazine that searches out great stories from around the world and translates them into English, all so that people like me who didn't pay attention in language classes at school can get a taste for what's happening beyond the Anglosphere. I think it's a totally brilliant idea for a magazine, and it's really new too. So the first issue was published in June this year, and the second one landed on shelves just a couple of weeks ago. So, Charles, first of all, thank you very much for taking time out to tell me about it.
Thank you very much indeed, Stephen. Very good to speak to you.
So I think I first met you at IndieCon, not this year, year before. So this is clearly like a thing you've been working on for a long time.
Well, it depends what you mean by a long time. I mean, it was kind of, I went to IndieCon this last year, so 2025, and many people were surprised that over the course of just 12 months, we'd gone from sort of having this concept of a magazine, an idea we really wanted to work on, to actually producing it. But it's been a whirlwind.
But so, all right, then, so take us back to the beginning. Where did this whole idea come from?
Well, this idea has been really buzzing around in my head for some time, because I think like many people, I've noticed that the mainstream Anglophone media is sort of flattening these narratives from beyond the Anglosphere, flattening non-Anglophone narratives. And very often the stories you hear from one country are very predictable, really. The editorial lines that come out of London and New York tend to be quite predictable. And of course, there's this crisis in global journalism all across the world, not just in the Anglophone media. And we wondered if there was a way of, on the one hand, helping English language readers read the world a bit differently, and also platforming all the great and interesting journalism and long form writing taking place all around the world in languages other than English. And at the same time, working with translators and showing our respect and admiration for the craft of translation, by which we mean sort of linguistic translation, but also really reading across and between cultures. And we thought there was a way of doing that, and that's why we set up Translator magazine.
And so what makes you the person to do this? Like, what was your background that led you up to this?
Well, what makes us the people to do that, and it's definitely not just about me, is because we're doing it. And we were sort of, I personally was like really surprised that other people weren't doing it. And I think there were some reasons why it was thought to be too hard or too complicated, too many moving parts. For me personally, I have worked in a newspaper. I've also worked in think tanks, and I'm a historian. I've written several books. But in all of the different parts of my career, I've always been reading very broadly. When I'm doing historical research, of course, I'm reading in multiple different languages. When I've been working in think tanks and similar, I've always been reading. One of the first things I do when I go to a new place is to buy the local newspapers and magazines and try and get a sense of what's going on the ground. So in a sense, that came very, very naturally to me. But I wasn't getting that in the English language media particularly. Which is not to say there isn't lots of fantastic English language journalism. Clearly there is. But I thought, well, what if it were possible, and I believe it's also necessary, but what if it were possible to give readers this sense of what really is being read and written and published in other parts of the world in languages other than English? And it's particularly important, I think it's particularly important now for political reasons. But I think it's also particularly important for English speakers, because people who speak English, because there's so much written in English, tend to imagine the world kind of takes place in English. For anyone who doesn't read English, they know it doesn't take place in English. So we can live in this sort of rather golden, glorious, but monolingual media bubble. And with all the ways the world is changing, it might be helpful, good, and indeed urgent to read the world differently.
And so I'm interested in what made you want to make this as a magazine, because taking that core mission of breaking beyond the Anglosphere, it seems to me there are several different ways that could be done. This could totally be a podcast. It could be a thing that just lives online.
Watch this space, Stephen. Watch this space.
All right, here we go. But so what was it that made you want to make this as a thing that's like ink on paper?
I think there's, and I know I'm talking to the converted, of course, but I think there's something about the physicality of the object, the way in which you need to engage physically with the object. At the back of the magazine, we actually have a crossword. So we're basically inviting people to deface this thing that we're producing, this object that we're producing. And we wanted Translator to be something that was picked up, shared, given to others, that can be spread around. I think we're also thinking about sort of the tradition of magazines in many places and newspapers as being these vectors of information. We wanted to, I think, when things are just online, it can be a little bit sort of surface, 2-dimensional or even 0-dimensional. Whereas if you have something in a magazine, then the reader has to engage with it in a different way. And I think for many people, actually, reading on paper is not some sort of young fogyish thing, or going Back to the Future, whatever. It's actually it's something that came up recently in a conversation I had with younger people about reading magazines. It's almost like an act of self-care. It's something that you could spend time with, that you engage with, that you really choose to learn about the world in a different way. And that was the kind of reading that we wanted to help our readers with.
Yeah. And I suppose also the magazine page must give you a load of possibilities that it's difficult to do in other places. So the magazine is designed by Jeremy, Leslie, and Usman Bari from Mag Culture, of course.
That's right. Yeah.
And it feels like a big part of what you're doing with it is kind of like layering on this meaning. So the stories have this like marginalia that allows you to kind of go deep into like the meaning of like one word, or like, the translator chose to use the word lad in this case, and they're like, so like, was that always there in your mind, or is that something that came when you started working with Jeremy and Usman?
I mean, that definitely came in our design discussions with Jeremy and with Osman. But I think it also comes from, if you speak to a translator, then a translator will tell you that translations are never perfect, that translation is a craft which involves choices. And very often these choices are invisible to people, or imagine that they're not there. But those choices are really important. The choice of whether you should translate a word one way or another way. Of course, if you're translating long form writing, journalism, reportage, that's written for an audience that would be familiar with the subject and familiar with the original subject, very close to it, then there are certain things that don't need to be contextualized, that certain things can be taken as read. Words can be used which somebody will understand, and if one translates them to English, just translates them, then they may be a little bit difficult to understand. So what the marginalia help us do is to provide that context, and also to engage with the craft of translation and the choices that are involved in it. And of course, often words that are really hard to translate are words that contain within them a degree of additional cultural meaning, which it may be really fascinating to the reader to understand.
Yeah. And I mean, I like, just personally, my experience of reading it is like, so on the one hand, it can be that you're reading the main text, and so the marginalia gives you like this extra depth. But also, it's just as likely that my eye lands on something in the marginalia first, and so then it's giving you like another entry point into the text, and you're like, oh, okay, good. Like, tell me a bit more about this. So it's sort of like you're having your cake and eating it.
Well, it's very important to say that we view Translator as being not an endpoint. This is not supposed to be encyclopedic. We imagine that people will be reading multiple publications, and we hope that what Translator, both the physical magazine and indeed online, is sort of like a portal into it's a way of expanding one's imagination as to all the different media landscapes which exist in languages other than English. And yes, if you happen to, your eye alights on some Argentinian slang, for example, in the margins of one article, and then maybe you think, oh, well, actually, I want to search that a bit more and find a bit more about that. That's great. That's something that we very much want to make possible. And in the way we've designed the magazine, it's partly about the marginalia, but it's also about making it fun. And I think the way things are presented, with quite a lot of color and some fantastic illustrations as well, it's about really trying to excite the imagination of the reader And if the reader wants to go on a journey and follow one article down a rabbit hole, or go down another rabbit hole, or use the margins as a starting point for their own research and discover a world of Japanese journalism they didn't know anything about, fantastic. That's us doing our job.
Totally, yeah. So there's like the fun and the energy and the color that you get from the magazine. But I noticed that at the start of this conversation, you talked about, like, the importance of Translator and like, how politically it's important. So, like, maybe tell us a little bit about what's that context, what's the kind of politically important bit of the mission here, and then how do you go about choosing stories that are going to allow you to achieve the goals that you're setting yourself?
Well, I think it's politically important on a couple of different levels. I mean, one is simply that journalism is under threat around the world for all kinds of reasons, from changes in business models, from technology, and from politics, from censorship. Many of these forces overlap and coincide. So one thing that we're able to do with Translator is to give voice to journalism around the world, to platform that, and hopefully to make people aware of what is being read and published around the world. And that in itself is very helpful. The second thing, I think, relates to the way in which journalism, in traditional understanding of journalism isn't just about journalists writing what they want to write. It's actually about all the people who are not journalists, about their stories, about what stories get told, and by whom. And so journalism is also really about power, and it's about, in some ways, trying to deal with the asymmetries of power which exist both between countries and within countries. So we think this is making a small contribution to a more diverse, more pluralistic media landscape, and inviting our readers to think about the way they read more broadly. We think that is actually ultimately also about power, and also about building global solidarities, and also ensuring that we don't end up in these monolinguistic media bubbles where actually there's a very, very small ecology of publications potentially, and where we don't see what is beyond the page that happens to be directly in front of us on our computer, on our tablet, on our phone.
And so then tell me about your process for choosing the stories you're going to publish, because this is always a choice for any magazine. So any magazine defines itself by the stories it tells, but normally magazines are commissioning those stories and so then shaping the stories with the writers as they go along, whereas you're selecting stories from other places. So I guess that selection then becomes even more important. So what are your kind of, what are the aims with the things that you're choosing?
Well, I mean, we start off, of course, with recommendations. So our readers recommend articles to us, and some of them we summarize for online for our weekly dispatch, and others we are able to translate in full for the magazine. So we start with a lot of recommendations. We can't, as our small team in London and with a group of contributing editors around the world, we can't read everything at all, but we do get recommendations from readers, from contributing editors. We have a hotline where people can, if they've read something interesting in a language other than English, they can, send us a message on WhatsApp or Signal or whatever. They can, of course, email us also. So that's the main way in which we're sorting articles first off. And then in terms of the selection of articles, for the sort of curation, if you like, of articles for the magazine, we've got a couple of different objectives there. One is that there's articles of different lengths and characters, so that, and I think this is really important with a physical magazine, that you can pick it up in any mood. You're in a good mood, you're in a bad mood, you're feeling a bit distracted, or you really want to concentrate on something important, and you'll find something in the magazine that will meet you wherever you are at that point in time. So that's an important choice, which goes into the way in which we curate. And that also informs, of course, some articles are far more, if you like, serious than others, and that they may deal with very painful, indeed harrowing issues or situations. There was an article in the first issue about cybercrime compounds in Southeast Asia, in Cambodia. This really harrowing story of people basically being in human slavery in modern day human slavery in Cambodia, many of those being individuals from mainland China. And this was a big story in Southeast Asia, but hadn't really broken through very much to the at least Western Anglophone media, and an absolutely extraordinary article from a publication called Initium Media, and very harrowing. And then we've also got, for example, in this issue, in issue 2, we've got an essay by a Palestinian father in Gaza about how fatherhood has changed as a result of the siege in Gaza. And personally, I found that very, very affecting. But we've also got an article from a Belgian publication about a sort of secondhand shop in French-speaking Belgium, and how this ends up being a cruising place for the OAPs of this Belgian town, and that's a very touching article. I mean, it's got elements of humor, it's got elements of romance, but it's also dealing with financial issues as well, because of course people going to the secondhand shop, sometimes some of them are looking for their dream antique to make some money, to buy something cheap and sell it more expensively. Other people are going there because they have to financially, and they're buying plates. So we really want there to be a wide range of different articles in the magazine from a range of different places, to meet the reader where they are.
Yes, yeah. And the story that you mentioned of the father in Gaza. So I think his name is Mohammed Al Zakzouk.
That's correct. Yes.
And so it's the first long story in the magazine, which obviously is important in terms of like the kind of hierarchy. But I thought that like that one, I mean, also I found that like incredibly moving. I think anyone who has kids or knows people with kids would find that very touching. It felt like there was something there in the intimacy of I mean, because obviously we have seen lots and lots of stories of the dreadful, dreadful things that happened in Gaza, and things are still happening in Gaza. But that particularly touched me, I thought. And I was trying to think about why. And then I realized that at the end, like there's a translator's notes about, I think they say something like, it's necessary to separate yourself from the words sometimes. And I thought maybe that's what it was that had like got through to me, because I was just reading this man in his words, not quite his words, it's been translated, but it felt so incredibly immediate that kind of got through to me in a way that however many other stories that I've read of terrible things in that place haven't quite touched me in the same way.
Well, you touched on something which is really important in the selection of articles, which is that there can be lots of good and interesting stories, but ones that are clearly from a particular place, written in that place, and speak to that place, but also speak to some broader narrative or human experience, which many of our articles do. An article, for example, in this case, one which deals with fatherhood or parenthood. Of course, we all have parents, and some of us may have children also. So it's something, this is part of our human experience. And so I think that can touch us on a human level in that way. And then there are other stories which touch on, maybe lightly and maybe more heavily, but they touch on questions of globalization or environmental degradation, or the way in which we use humor in our lives. So a good story for us will be one that isn't just a story that is about a particular place, but one which can have this broader reach. That's certainly what we're looking for. And in this case, we don't actually normally have a translator's note, although of course all our translators are named, of course, in the articles, and we have their bios, etc., and we make reference to other works they've been working on and things like that. But in this case, it was particularly important because one of the things we are trying to do is to talk about the craft of translation itself, and render translation visible and render translators visible. And in this particular case, with Noor's translation of Muhammad's work, Noor Al-Jaduli and Mohammed Al-Zakzouk, it was important to say that there is a psychological toll, a psychic toll in conducting this kind of work, because you do get close to your subject. In this case, Noor herself is a Palestinian translator in Jordan. So there is that proximity, and that proximity is something that is in this case hard to deal with.
Yeah. Hence the necessity for the Belgian antique shops. I totally get that. That also. So I mean, the vast majority of the magazine is about text in translation, but then you also have a photo piece in the middle of the magazine. So this issue, it's the Gen Z protests in Kathmandu. Like, tell me, like, where that came from. Was it always in your mind that you'd have this kind of photo story, or did that come as the magazine was coming together?
Well, we made a decision fairly early on that we weren't going to have photographs associated with individual articles, that we wanted to go for illustration. And we thought that was potentially a more creative way of not, if you have an article about Russia, you don't just put up a picture of President Putin from 5 years ago, but you work with illustrators who can creatively engage also with the text. Illustrators are also from beyond the Anglosphere. And so there can be something interesting can occur, I think, in that other form of translation between text and image, which occurs when the text from a publication beyond English meets the translator, meets the illustrator. So that's one thing. But then we thought it would be good to have photographs which perform a rather different role in the magazine, which is as essentially as a photo essay. In the first issue, we had a photo essay by a photographer called Hassan Kamil about Sudan, which actually has won several prizes and is very, very strong indeed. In this, we were very lucky to work with an Indian photographer, Ishan Thankar, and to have his photographs from, as you say, the Gen Z protests in Kathmandu. And what we're trying to do in both those cases is to get some photographs which can lead the reader into something which is very, very important, which they might be not fully aware of. So another story which needs to be told, which should be told. But in this case, we're telling that story, or an element of that story, more through the images than through text.
Mm-hmm. And I guess on those pages, it really helps that this is quite a large format. So it's a relatively big magazine, so you can fit quite a lot of imagery on one spread.
Yes, and on some pages, I think we've got as much as 3 photographs on one page, and it doesn't look at. I mean, the magazine is quite a large format. I should say that it's not terribly unwieldy, and you can roll it up, you can even fold it. My colleagues thought I was completely bonkers that I really thought it was important to be able to roll it up or fold it, but I want it to be portable. So we've sort of tried to find the right balance between being sort of quite striking, I think visually striking, and striking also in terms of its size, but also having that degree of portability.
Yeah.
And you're right. It does mean that we can have, 2 or 3 photographs on a page. And of course, one other wonderful thing about magazines, which we shouldn't forget, not that you will have forgotten this, is the power of juxtaposition, physical juxtaposition of stories and subjects. And there's something also exciting in that which can occur on the page, where you've got maybe 2 very different stories in juxtaposition. There are sort of, or the way people read a physical magazine, some people read from the end, some people read from the beginning, and they flick through and they have a look around first, and the role of serendipity. So all of these things, I think, are more possible in a physical magazine, and what makes physical magazines beautiful, in a way that online, you either scroll up, you scroll down, that's it.
Yeah.
And there's less, the algorithm says, well, if you like this, then you like something almost identical to that. Whereas in a magazine, we say, well, you like this, well, sorry, because the next article is completely different, but that's exciting. So, yeah.
Totally. Couldn't agree more. It's also, I noticed this is almost to the millimeter fits within the Royal Mail large letter sizes. So it's just like, it was important to you that this thing could roll up. Did you always think of this as being a big magazine, or is this something that came with like Jeremy and Osman saying, looking around the shop, hey, look, let's make this big so it stands up above other stuff?
Well, I mean, there are lots of magazines of different shapes and sizes. There are some magazines, of course, where with each publication, they make it a different shape and size. We did want to make it striking. We didn't want to make it impossible that it couldn't be sold, in fairly mainstream shops. So, it can be along a newspaper. It's not so large that it's, it can't be sold in those places, because we do aspire for it to be sold fairly broadly. That's what we like, because we think we're performing a function which actually, they're good translated articles which deserve wide readership, and that's what we're there to try and provide. But yeah, we just had our launch, which was great fun, of the second issue just recently. And one thing we did at the end of that launch was we actually provided some postcards of bits of the artwork from the magazine, bits of the illustrations, and we gave people stamps and said, like, send this off to friends, family, lovers, whoever, and spread the word. And that's also something that we're very, very keen to do, is to make sure that this is, a physical object which can travel, and to create a wider community.
Mm-hmm. Good idea. Using print to spread the print. I like that. That's good. So having talked about the print, the first version of Dispatch, I think, of Translator, is it right that the Dispatch newsletter came before all of the prints?
Yeah. So basically what we started doing earlier this year was we thought, like, where do we begin? We know we want to have a paper publication, a magazine in print, and we're definitely working towards that. We also want to provide some online presence. How do we begin? So actually we begin, and we're still doing it now. Every week we summarize 3 articles from around the world, from beyond the Anglosphere. So not translations, but summaries, in order to give a taste, partly because these are things that are coming across our desk as stories that people are saying, well, maybe you should translate this for the magazine, but also as a way of starting off that process of engaging with readers with an example of the kind of writing that exists around the world. So we're doing that every week online. We've actually introduced a new format there called Read Between the Lines, which also exists in the magazine now. And Read Between the Lines is a format where we essentially ask a journalist or an expert in a particular place to take an article from their local media landscape and to sort of decode it a bit for an English language reader who won't necessarily know the context or some of the language. Or I think this is really important as well, given the situation of global journalism around the world, things that can be said or things that can't be said, and why. So there, for example, online, in the magazine, we have a wonderful read between the lines by an originally Hong Kong-based journalist called Jessie Lau, now based in London, writing about something called the Mask Park incident in China, which is this huge sex scandal in China, affecting many, many hundreds of thousands of people. And again, a story that hadn't sort of made its way into at least the Western mainstream English language media. And so what Jessie was doing is she was taking an article from Chinese media, which is often quite close to the state in different ways, or regulated or censored, or people have to be careful, and talking about what that article was saying, what it wasn't saying, and what wasn't being said as well. So that's another way of giving our readers a sense of not just stories which are circulating beyond the Anglosphere, but also the way in which they're circulating and in the environment in which they're circulating.
Yeah. Now, you said earlier, when I mentioned podcast, you said watch this space. And in the magazine, you talk about there are more, you say something about broadening online and audiovisual formats. So are you able to talk about any of that stuff yet?
What do you want me to spill all?
Go on.
Well, I mean, the strapline of the magazine is translated the world overheard, and we do think that there's real scope for creating audio and video elements in which we continue the dialogue between translators and journalists and editors in an audio format. We have done a bit of that online on our Instagram. We've done a little bit of that, and actually at the launch, we had some wonderful recordings of contributors to the magazine, contributors to the Street Talk sections, where we get non-writers to write about whatever the hyper-local news is where they are, readings from their contributions to issue 2. And so we're exploring ways in which we can really platform some of this more in an audio-visual way. So the magazine is the linchpin of everything. The physical magazine is the linchpin of everything, alongside the weekly Substack dispatch. But then, yes, we think there's also scope, of course, for meeting people in real life as well, not just online. Essentially, we view the magazine as a portal and as an opportunity for different kinds of gathering, and why not audio gathering as well?
Absolutely, yeah. And is that so? The magazine is the linchpin. Does, for example, like the newsletter, does that exist kind of in its own right, doing its own thing, or does that exist to point people to the print?
That's a good question. I mean, I'd say it exists to point people to the print, largely, but of course, people who subscribe for free to the dispatch. So, I mean, it is completely free. So subscribe. They're not necessarily going to subscribe to the magazine, and that's fine too. So hopefully these products coexist and reinforce one another. And I certainly hope they do. And it's certainly very important in our process for putting the magazine together, is to have this constant engagement with what's being written beyond the Anglosphere, some of which we can show through our summaries and dispatches. But it's also hopefully appealing to different readerships. There are some people who want, what they really want is 3 stories in their inbox every Sunday that tell them something they didn't know about a place beyond the Anglosphere. That's a shot of something new, I think. And there are other people who are going to have more time on their Sundays to, sit down and read a magazine for an hour or two, or put it by their bed, or take it on the train, or whatever. So, I think if there are different formats, one can appeal to different groups of people at different times, and that's what we want to do.
Yeah, absolutely. So, I mean, we're coming to the end of the year now. This has been a big year for Translator.
Yes.
I mean, the newsletter started, the magazine started, second issue out. Looking back over all of that, like, is there a bit that you would pick out as being the highlights? Like, the thing that you kind of like, wow, this is a thing to really remember and kind of luxuriate in.
Well, I mean, I've definitely luxuriated in the smell of the magazine when it's first arrived at my, when I first seen it. In fact, I first saw it actually at an event. This issue 2, I first saw it at an event a few weeks ago, because it was shipped directly from the printers to this event where I was talking about Translator magazine. But I think the real highlights for me have been obviously the launch events for issue 1 and issue 2, where I think in both cases, so the first issue 1 launch took place in a place called the Casa Italiana, which is an Italian community centre in London, and that was great fun. And it spoke to our values of community very much. The second was just recently in a place called Ibraz, which is a new cultural venue in London, which is dedicated to, amongst other things, platforming the voices of the global majority. And that also felt very much aligned with us. And so I was really pleased we were able to do it that way. But give me one more minute. The thing which I found really most exciting and heartening is the way in which, particularly after the first issue, people have come to us and said, "Oh, we love your publication and we'd like to recommend this story. And have you thought about this publication?" And the willingness of those publications to actually let us translate their stories and then republish those stories. What we've discovered is there really is this vibrant, very alive world, and very diverse and pluralistic world of magazine publication, newspaper publication, all kinds of media publication beyond the Anglosphere. And it is just a real honor to be able to bring some of that into the Anglophone world.
Yeah. Well, look, I mean, I'm not at all surprised that they've been so enthusiastic, because I think like I said at the start, I just think this is such a good idea. Like you just describe it and it's like, yes, yes, I would like to read that. But then also it's been done so well. So, I think it's such an impressive magazine. So thank you for telling me about it, and good luck with taking it on to all the things it's going to do.
Thank you very much indeed, Steve. Lovely to talk to you.
Cheers.